have an unidentified flying object.
Researcher on a mission with Dr. J.N. Elias.
We have an unidentified flying object.
Welcome back to another episode of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I am your host, Dr. J, and joining me tonight is my co-host live in London, Johnny Webb. Johnny, welcome back.
No, I'm with you, Dr. J. How are we doing this evening?
We are doing great. Well, before we bring on our fascinating guest, who is obviously the most important topic to me, which you'll all hear about in a second, first I want to go through some UFO news. The other day, if you all recall, one of you submitted the fact that a spherical UFO or a cigar-shaped UFO went into a volcano. I received that news from a listener. I did not know where, and I finally found out that happened in Mexico. They are always going into volcanoes, which begs the question, what is going on? What is there in Mother Earth that they're looking for, or is it really an entrance? I got some other amazing news for you here. Another cigar-shaped UFO over a Minnesota town. And if that wasn't enough, even another cigar-shaped UFO over Argentina. Now, here's two different types of UFOs that were, this is all, by the way, in the last 24 hours. A diamond-shaped UFO was hovering over a New York lake. Again, another natural resource. What is it? Why are they going to Earth's natural resource? Again, all you listeners out there, I would love to get your feedback. Go to the website, hit the contact page just as you have been, and give me your thoughts, especially if you want me to read your letter on air. Be sure and say that, of course, and tag your name in there. And the final piece of news I want to mention is the glowing UFO over Argentina. Actually, no, I said that one, and the diamond shaped over the New York lake. The last piece of news is what we talked about the other day for a good long hour, but now it's changed because finally the things are available. And that is the Roswell slides. They've created, just like Nick Redfern and I said on May 5th, by the time yesterday, May 6th came, there would be more questions than there would be answers. And sure enough, that is exactly what is going on. Johnny, did you have a chance to look at him, by the way?
Well, I was looking at the clear ones. They're all very nice. You know, you've got, Eisenhower, Bing Crosby, Clark Gable. These are really clear photos. But when it comes to that particular one I saw in the box, it's not that clear. Maybe, once they've made their money on it and then it becomes more public domain, maybe we'll see a better Photoshop of it, a better sort of close up. But now I'm still out on the box. It reminds me one of an old Peru video I saw about 10 years ago of a guy up in the mountains. He says, "Come and have a look at this. I've got a little alien." And he takes us into an old cabin and digs out this small little alien. And it looks just like that one. So whether it's different, we'll find out in the near future, I'm sure.
Yeah. And you know what? And obviously, as we talked about the other night with Nick Redfern, there's a lot of controversy. And as soon as we bring on our guests, we're going to continue to talk about this. But before we do, I just want to tell everybody out there, if you have any questions, of course, feel free to tweet them out with hashtag DMTalk, as in dark matter talk. And of course, you could throw the at Dr. J Radio Live, so I will be able to see it. And by the way, let me give a few shout outs to the people I see that are on Twitter. I see Lou Sheehan, of course. Congratulations again, Lou, for being, I think, winner number 7 out of the 14 so far. And I also see, of course, Danny from Nollins. Thank you, Danny, for being loyal and on the show. And I also see here Freighter F-Disc. Freighter, nice to hear from you. And again, all those questions, you guys feel free to send tweets. And hour 2 will be taking calls if you have any. But now, let's get to my favorite topic within ufology. This is where and you've heard me say this several times because it's true. The answers to ufology, at least in my belief, lie within alien abduction. Why? Because the people that are taken are the ones that actually have interaction with these extraterrestrials. They can tell you what they look like, how they interact with humans, how they interact with each other, with other ETs, what they do in the ships, how they walk, how they move, everything. And that is why every time someone that is an expert or is a validated, verified abductee, I take it very seriously. And today's guest, of course, if those of you who've been watching the Twitter feeds, the Instagram feeds, and of course the website, you already know who it is. But for those of you who don't know, let's go ahead and bring it on. And that is Mrs. Kathleen Marden. Miss Marden, welcome to the show.
Hello, great to be with you again.
It's always a pleasure to have you on because, first of all, you're just one of the nicest people I know. Always the sweetest and just an amazing woman all around and so intelligent. And then on top of that, you're literally a walking encyclopedia of knowledge. And you're always very professional about it. I remember going back to reading your a few books back. That's when I first got hooked on you. And then, of course, the fact that you've been involved in this ever since, almost 50 years because of your aunt. So to me, you are the most qualified person living to speak on this topic right now. If not just living, if not ever in all of history within UFO abductions. But before we jump into the abductions, as you heard, the last piece of UFO news we talked about was the Roswell slides. And I had some concerns for a couple reasons. One of them, the picture that I saw, you see a dress, which is a woman. Now, I don't mean to be sexist. I said this the other day. In the 40s, in the 50s, women in the military were nurses or secretaries. You would not, I wouldn't expect to see a woman in such a clandestine organization. Any photograph you see, the 40s, 50s, of that era, you do not see a woman in the military that is sitting next to a B-2 bomber, except on the assembly line. I'm talking about on an active base. That's just one of the concerns. The second concern is it looks like it's in a museum. That was the impression I got. What do you think about these slides?
I have been pretty reticent about commenting on them because without empirical evidence, it's really just an emotional response. But John Greenwald had a write-up yesterday, and it made a lot of sense to me. It was a very good analysis of the body, the case that the body is in, and what is in the background. And this is on the Black Vault. John wrote that, well, first of all, this case does appear to be in a museum. There is a label on the case, such as what you find in a museum. And then if you look behind that case, there is what appears to be a gorilla, perhaps in another case, and there is also a label there. It makes sense to me that that is what we're seeing in these photographs. And to me, it would be really a huge surprise if we were to find out that which would be top secret or above top secret photographs had leaked into a private collection and had remained in that collection unknown for all of these years. It makes much more sense, if we're going to talk about common sense, that what you have is unusual photographs of some museum exhibit. We know that these people traveled all over the world, and that they probably visited many, many places. And it would be very interesting to find out where this was actually taken.
I'm so glad you mentioned the fact that we need more empirical evidence and that we could only make an emotional response, because you're absolutely right. Until we have all the analysis, that's the same impression that I had. I could only base on what I've seen, and everything you said is on point of what I believe. It doesn't fit. And another thing, and Jaime Maussan is a great fan. I don't mean to say anything bad about him, and I've worked with him for several years. But every time a piece of UFO news comes, it's always upload it right away because 2 days later it's old news. And so when he first told me that he was planning this event for May 5th back in I think it was end of January, well before the UFO Congress, I was a little blown away that he would be sitting on something considering the history of years that he's had of urgency of news. Not to say that there was anything bad about that, but I was just wondering maybe he wanted to analyze them a little more. But again, we won't know. And what happens if we do prove that these are photographs? Again, that doesn't prove that what's in the photograph is what we hope it to be. It is, to me, this is just reminiscent of what happened a little over 20 years ago with the alien autopsy. Only this time, I hope it's a little more favorable outcome. With that being said, though, Ms. Marden, we already do have a specific question for you from a listener. Do you want to hear it?
Sure.
This comes from Lou Sheehan. It says, is Ms. Marden aware if there were any federal governmental investigations of Betty and Barney Hill, and has anyone tried a FOIA request? And I'm pretty sure I know the answer to this, but go ahead and give it to Lou.
There is a lawyer who has been working on a FOIA request for me, and his first request was ignored, so he was going to try it again. Certainly there was some government interest in this, but the individuals who approached Betty and Barney came as individuals with their own individual interest and not in an official capacity. For example, Barney's best friend after this happened was a man named Jim McDonald, who had recently retired as an officer at Pease Air Force Base. He was also a CIA agent. And so it makes you wonder, I've been told over and over again, once in the CIA, always in the CIA. So in what capacity was he engaging in this friendship with Barney? That's a good question. I don't have the answer to it, but it certainly does raise questions. Also, Robert Homan and C.D. Jackson worked for IBM, but they were employed funded by the government for the work that they did. And it was their goal to attempt to acquire a piece of hardware during Betty's contact experiments that they could take to IBM. There was this kind of involvement, but nothing as far as, the president calling them up or someone calling from the Pentagon or anything like that. It was done individually.
The Betty and Barney Hill put the abduction phenomena on the map, but now we all know that clearly that wasn't the first case. I know Dr. Jacobs was able to, at least through his methods, trace it back to what he believes the 1880s, because he said he couldn't go further back because the lack of people that were alive. He had gotten stories from, the senior citizens who heard stories of their great-grandparents having little people coming into the rooms and such. But I want to ask you about that. When do you think, again, this is obviously speculation. It's very hard for us to find empirical evidence of alien abduction from the 17th century or before. But how long do you think this has been going on?
That's really hard to say. Certainly, it stepped up during the 60s and even more during the 70s. I think that David Jacobs is probably right about it occurring on a very limited basis back in the 1880s, 1890s. Bud Hopkins had a case that I believe was 1939. And I think that there's a very good possibility that they have been around for a very long time. And from time to time, they intervene and maybe conduct experiments, maybe attempt to see where we are on an evolutionary scale, to determine whether or not it's time to become worried or whether or not it's time to bring us in as part of their cosmic kindergarten, you might say. But that's all speculation based upon some evidence, but nothing in terms of real solid evidence. The solid evidence is what we have been able to collect since Betty and Barney Hill were abducted, and even before that, going back to Antonio Villas-Boas in Brazil.
That case, that's right. That was the case, and at the time, people really thought he was daydreaming or belonged in a ward, because what we hear, that if he was to tell the story now, obviously it'd be well accepted, but at the time, to talk about extraterrestrials coming down and having sexual relations didn't sound right, but now it's commonplace. That's the case you're referring to, right?
Yes, it is. And, the big focus in that case was upon sexual relations. I suppose that it's titillating, and so that's what they wanted to focus on. They didn't say that he and his brother had observed a UFO at close range before the night that he was taken, and that on the night that he was taken, he was out plowing the field. Of course, he's in the southern hemisphere. And so he was out at night. It was about midnight, I guess, plowing, and this light came in, and it came in closer and closer. And the motor on the tractor died. He got off the tractor to try to run away and was intercepted. He was taken onto this craft in a pretty strange way, because he claimed that he was taken up a ladder. And, I've heard of ramps. I've heard of people, simply being taken up on like a tractor beam. We hear a lot about that today. But the part of being taken up on a ladder is unique. It's unusual. Once inside, he was exposed to like a noxious gas. He was left alone in the room. And, that could have been a sterilization process. I've heard of that before in some cases, nothing recently.
There's actually one case that sticks out in my mind, the only one that I recall, and that's the Smith case from Truckee, California. I believe it was in the 60s. You recall that case?
The Smith case. No, I don't recall the specific details.
This gentleman, three people were hunting, bow and arrow hunting, and this one gentleman's last name Smith with a Y, ending with an A, S-M-Y-T-H-E. I don't recall his first name. He got separated from his group, and he thought that they launched a search party for him. And what he thought was a helicopter, he started walking towards it, and he realized that it was not spherical, but more disc-shaped, and he got scared. So as it got closer to him, so what he ended up doing is climbing a tree, and this thing landed, and apparently a robot-looking being came out, as well as two silver beings. And what happened is they were taunting him at the base of the tree, and he was dropping burning pieces of clothing, and he was firing his bows and arrows at the robot, which would just literally bounce off. And the robot, this is the weird way he would describe it, it had like a rectangular mouth and two red fiery eyes. Clearly, it was pure metallic. But he said it would the word he used was belch, a noxious gas that would make him nauseous. And this happened all night, and eventually at some point, a second robot ended up coming out, and both of them released enough gas to where he was unconscious, woke up on the floor, and it was daylight at that point. That was I guess because I'm in California, that was very well cemented. But that was the only other case I've heard of the gas. I do recall hearing about the fact that the disinfecting, but what other cases do you know of where they've used some sort of gas?
Off the top of my head, I have reviewed so many cases, I can't give you the name of the individual. I do recall the one that you just described, but I could not give you the name of the individual. There's also a case in Florida from many, many years ago where there was, I believe it was a scout leader that was up in a tree. And I think that it was under similar circumstances as well. So, but I have heard of this before.
Because you've been involved with this for so long, obviously I don't doubt for 1 second. It doesn't surprise me 1 second that you couldn't recall each name, because you've dealt with at least, my guess is a four-figure sum of cases over your lifetime.
Well, at least 1,000.
Yeah, exactly.
Yes.
At least that. Now, you mentioned earlier that clearly they stepped up the taking of people in the 60s and 70s, and obviously that's when the phenomena started to become more recognized. Even then, it was very taboo. But the evolution of what's been taking place has been interesting me for several reasons. First of all, going back to the fact that it started much slower, and then, of course, after World War II, you have the humongous wave of sightings, which our good friend and your co-author and colleague, Stanton Friedman, says that when we detonated our nuclear bombs, it was akin to setting off a nuclear a domino effect, where the nuclear explosion literally went on for infinity, affecting everything in the galaxy and announcing to the entire universe that, and the way he put it is, uh-oh, the kids found the matches. And that makes perfect sense, because the first thing we do when we figure out how to split an atom is we build a weapon of mass destruction. But then, of course, we have the increase of sightings and then the increase of abductions. But in your history of researching this, was your first case of where you heard about hybrid children being involved?
Oh, boy, I'm trying to think.
Because this actually happened to your aunt and uncle, right?
Yes, well, there's a long history of reproductive material being extracted from experiencers. During Betty's and Barney's case, the needle in the navel for Betty, the sperm extraction from Barney. Betty was told that it was some kind of pregnancy test. She didn't understand what was going on. But we heard over and over again throughout the years that this has been repeated. And then I have the case of Jenny Henderson in my book with Denise Stoner, The Alien Abduction Files. And Jenny Henderson saw these fetuses in gestational tanks on board the craft way back in 1978. This was early 1978. And I know that that was before anything was ever published about this. So, and it was in her diary dating back that far.
Wow.
So I think that is the first case that I've heard of it. But I'm sure it was going on.
going on almost 4 decades. And that actually, it surprises me, but it doesn't surprise me, because we've always heard that they're able to, since they impregnate women, they take the sperm from men, and if they don't take the ovum from women, they actually implant the fetuses in the woman. They take them out very prematurely, so they do raise them essentially in those tanks, right?
Yes, that's correct. I've been speculating about why they might possibly insert those sacs into a woman's uterus, leave it there for a short period of time, and then remove it again. But I know that I have some evidence from experiencers that they tend to have a lot of scar tissue, suggesting that they've had multiple pregnancies, even if they have not. And we know that there is a very strong history of reproductive problems among experiencers, female and male. So, why would they do that? Is it to make these hybrids more human? Is it because they acquire a human soul inside the body? Those are some speculations, but nobody knows the answer, as far as I know.
I hate to break this train of thought again, but we do have two more questions from the listeners. One relating, of course, to your family's case, and another about ufology and abduction and hold. I'm going to ask the one relating about your family's case. Do you know of any of the reasons James Earl Jones was so interested in the case he made a movie based about it? That's the question that's reading.
No, I don't know what his motivation was, except for the opportunity to make money.
That's true.
And he played Barney.
That's right.
And did it very, very well, I might say. So I don't know if he had a personal interest in UFOs and abductions.
He did spend some time with Barney to get the character right, I heard, right?
No, the movie was made aired in 1975. Barney died in 1969 at age 46 from a massive cerebral hemorrhage.
He listened to the actual the hypnosis tapes, so he was able to gain the insight that we get today when we listen to those tapes.
Yes, he was able to listen to Barney's voice on the hypnosis tapes, and also the intensity of Barney's emotional response as he stood in the close encounter field moments before he actually had that close encounter, when Dr. Simon was forcing him to remember this. And he did not want to proceed. He did not want to remember what happened next.
The second question is pure speculation, and it's actually about ufology as a whole, but it relates to abduction. It says, what effect did Whitley Strieber's book Communion have on ufology, if any? I know it's a hard question to answer, but that's what was written to us.
Okay. Well, I can answer that question based upon the responses that I've heard from many, many experiencers. And that is that when they saw that face on the front of communion, it was confirmation that their experiences were real.
I exactly. And a lot of people that I've heard about it, even in Unsolved Mysteries, I recall there was this one case of this gentleman. He was a sailor, and he was waiting to get picked up by, I believe, the Navy, and he was waiting at a convenience store, and he saw a book, and it had the famous cover of the Communion of the Grey, and he bought it, but and it struck a chord with him. And then, of course, he had missing time. Apparently, what happened is he was waiting for the Jeep to pick him up, and then they never came. So he called back the base, and they said, we came, waited for you, you never were there. But besides the point is, just as you said, it clearly affected many people because it confirmed so many of the cases. Now, I know we've talked about this in the past, and I don't want to beat the case with I don't want to beat the dead horse with the stick any further, but just it fascinates me so much. Your family's case, Betty and Barney Hill, two things that really stick out to me. One thing that you mentioned is when Betty was given the needle placed in her navel and told it was a pregnancy test, that was at least 10 plus years before we humans were doing it, right?
Yes, this was before amniocentesis was being used routinely in a hospital setting.
And therefore, just off that alone, people can just clearly see that there's a good element of truth, because you have beings that are using what we end up using down the line. Essentially, what you can infer from that is that these beings were intelligent enough to get to where we ended up getting to by having this test already being performed. So when Betty talked about it in the 60s, obviously people probably said, "Oh, that sounds crazy." But then, of course, when we started practicing the same procedure, obviously, I'm sure it woke a lot of people up. The second thing that stands out from the case, there's so many, but the second thing that always it fascinates me so much is Marjorie Fish. The fact that she created that star map, I believe it was 7 years it took her.
It took her about that long, and it wasn't just one model that she made. She constructed 23 models before she was able to find a match using a frame, monofilament line, and beads of different sizes and colors that corresponded to the sizes and colors of the different stars that were in this section of space. And she had to go to the astronomy department at the university and sit there with the catalogs and hand copy all of the data out of the catalogs, because this was before we had photocopying machines. And then she would take it home. She did the math to know where to put every one of those stars in its proper location 55 light years out. It was an extraordinary undertaking. And after several years, she still did not have a match for Betty's map that she had sketched as a result of a post-hypnotic suggestion by Dr. Benjamin Simon. He had instructed her that she would be able to go home and draw that map if she could remember it accurately, and if it didn't have too much of a negative emotional impact upon her, that it wasn't too stressful for her to do. And so she did go home and she sketched that. And it was published in the first book that was ever written about this case, The Interrupted Journey by John G. Fuller. That is a book that contains the transcripts to the hypnosis sessions that Betty and Barney had with Dr. Simon.
That is actually the first book on alien abduction I read, and I have it's definitely one of the earlier editions, because you could clearly tell. First of all, I acquired it a little over 2 decades ago, but just you could tell from the cover. I don't have it handy to look in of the date, but nonetheless, that is at the time, prior to books such as yours, the Alien Abduction Files, and others that talked about several cases, to me, that was the best one because it had an entire encounter versus other books. For instance, Fire in the Sky, which obviously came out much later, that was the isolated incident. And yes, Travis had a lot of evidence in there, such as the tree growth and all that. But the interrupted journey, there was just so much more substance to that it sucked me in so much to where I read that book multiple times. I honestly, I lost count at this point.
Yes. Well, the important thing about the interrupted journey was that it gives the transcripts to the hypnosis, so that what Betty and Barney recalled, and then what they recalled under hypnosis. None of the evidence is in that book. The aftermath is not in that book as the years went through, because it was published in 1966, not long after the hypnosis sessions and before most of the scientific work was completed. But it was a very good book. And now getting back to the star map that appeared in The Interrupted Journey and also appears in the book that I wrote with Stanton Friedman, Captured: The Betty and Barney Hill UFO Experience. Stanton wrote 2 chapters about the star map in our book, about Marjorie's work and his involvement in it as well. Because Marjorie finally, in 1972, had a match. After all of these years, I met Marjorie for the first time when I turned 21 years old, and that was in 1969. And that was the first time that Marjorie had actually gone to Betty's house to visit and to discuss the star map. They had written back and forth to each other. They had discussed it on the phone, but this was their first face-to-face meeting. And so Betty and Marjorie were working on that star map while I was out celebrating my 21st birthday. I wish that, now I wouldn't have been so interested in going out and having my first legal drink. I would have wanted to spend more time with Betty and Marjorie, but hindsight is 2020.
That's right.
Marjorie did an enormous amount of work on this star map identification. And in the end, after all of this work that she did and finally getting a match in 1972 because a new catalog was published and it had new distance data and 3 stars that were not there on in the information until 1972 finally had their place on the map. And then there was a perfect match for Betty's map. And what you have to remember, I think, about this is that if you look at Marjorie's identification, the 2 base stars, the largest ones on the map, Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2, are closer together than what we see on Betty's map. However, we have to consider Betty's perspective. When she was looking at that map, she was looking up into it. She wasn't looking at it face on. And that's something that Betty had to explain to the scientists who vetted Marjorie's work. Walter Webb wrote about this, and he understood it and realized that that was what was going on. He was an astronomer who was the first investigator on the Hill case. There were other astronomers involved in this too, including Alan Hynek, who vetted the work, and also Dr. Walter Mitchell, who was the head of the astronomy department at Ohio State University. They vetted Marjorie's work to see if it was accurate, and yes, in fact, it was. The interesting thing about this map is that the sun is there. Zeta Reticuli 1 and 2, which can be seen only from the southern hemisphere, are there, and they have 5 different trade routes running between the 2. They are pretty close together, almost so close together that there's been a lot of debate about whether or not they could actually have planets in a stable orbit. Astronomers believe that they can, according to the letters that Stanton Friedman has given to me when he did his research on this. We have Alpha Mensae on it. We have Tau Ceti on it, and some fairly close star systems to us. So it is quite an extraordinary map. All of the stars on Betty's map were sun-like, although only 5% of the stars in that part of our local galactic neighborhood are sun-like. It's quite a coincidence. In fact, a statistical analysis done on this indicated that the chance of Betty drawing this simply by chance was between 1 in 10,000 and 1 in a million. So it was quite extraordinary, and it convinced a lot of scientists that this was a true event. Because this wasn't the only piece of evidence. There was more evidence as well that has been tested since then.
Absolutely. And before I even got to the part about the star map, I was already convinced because of so many of the other features. But the star map, as you said, for the reasons you just stated, is why it stuck out so much for me, because of the fact that none of the stars had been, or not none of them, should I say, a lot of the stars that you identified weren't even known to any astronomer at the time that she wrote drew the map, and Marjorie started hanging the balls with string in her, was it living room, if I'm not mistaken?
Yes, yes. And the greatest challenge she had is that she had cats who liked to play with the balls on the strings. So she always had to protect those bottles or the cats would get in there and wreak havoc with them.
Actually, we do have another a question from another listener involving, Betty and Barney Hill. It says, is Miss Marden aware if there, or no, that was the wrong one. Sorry, it's this one. It is assuming there are any. How about Miss Marden reveal a tidbit unknown to the public about the Betty and Barney Hill case?
Oh my goodness. I revealed a lot in Captured, the Betty and Barney Hill UFO experience that was unknown to the public. It was so fascinating when Betty began to permit me to interview her on a weekly basis, to have copies of her and Barney's hypnosis tapes, to go on trip after trip to the White Mountains where I interviewed her, to undergo me playing devil's advocate and trying to refute her case. And she eventually turned over all of the 40 plus years of files, letters to and from scientists, all of the investigation files on that case. It was quite extraordinary, but something that she never told anybody, and that I only found not that long ago, was evidence of contact after this experience occurred. Now, I knew of some because when I was taking care of Betty, and I'm her niece, and I had promised Betty, when she paid for me to go to college and helped me through, and I lived with her during that time frame, I promised her that I would repay her somehow. And as she was growing older, she said, "Do you remember that promise? Would you please take care of me when I am old?" And then when I received the tragic news that Betty had cancer, lung cancer, I moved close to Betty so that I could take care of her. And I ended up living in her home and just traveling back and forth to my home during all of that time that she underwent hospice care. And during that time frame, and I wrote about this in Captured, we believe that there was an event that happened in her home. Betty's daughter and I would relieve each other. She lived in Arkansas at the time, so she would come out and she would spend 2 weeks or a month with her daughter and sleep overnight there. And I would drive over, it was about maybe 6 or 8 miles from where I was living to Betty's house, and I would drive over every morning to be there by about 8 o'clock and relieve Betty's daughter, Connie, for the day. So on this particular morning, I arrived, and things were not the way they usually were. All of the shades were still drawn, and Betty and Connie were always up at about 6 o'clock in the morning. The coffee was going. Betty was reading newspapers. She would read 5 or 6 newspapers a day. She was a voracious reader. On that particular morning, it was still kind of dark in the house. Nobody was dressed. They were sitting in their pajamas. And the back door was open, but the deadbolt lock was out. And so I went in, and they told me that something very strange had happened, and they just couldn't explain it. Betty had fallen down, and at this point, I do have to add that she was suffering from lung cancer, and it had the tumor had affected her brachial nerve, and she had lost the use of one arm. And now she had fallen and she had broken the other arm. And she had also lost the ability to walk from this advancing cancer. And on this particular morning, the brace that was on her arm that had been fractured had been removed. It was a flexible cast. It was the type that could be removed. But it had been removed, and it was across the room on a chair that Betty couldn't possibly have walked to. And there was an ace bandage that was wrapped around this thing, and it was removed and neatly folded on that chair. Now, Betty couldn't possibly have folded it and put it there. And Connie swore that she hadn't. And Connie could not figure out why she slept so late. She was always up at 6 o'clock in the morning. And something strange also occurred. Raisa, Betty's cat, who was her constant companion, was afraid of Betty, suddenly so frightened of Betty that she would skirt the perimeter of the room looking nervously at her as she went out to the litter box or out to her food. This was highly unusual. Raisa hid underneath the bed for an entire week. I documented all of this in a journal that I was keeping because all of a sudden, Betty's condition improved. Her eyes had sort of glazed over, and you know, she looked close to death. And suddenly, her eyes were blue and sparkling. She felt so much better than she had that we were wondering if a miracle had occurred. And perhaps the extraterrestrial visitors who had taken her in 1961 had come back and taken her again. And so we had a medical doctor who was also documenting Betty's progress, and he was amazed. We took her to the doctor for her checkup. The doctor had said that Betty's fracture would never heal. In other words, she would pass away before it would heal because of the condition and because she was a chain smoker. Well, when we took her back and she had another x-ray, the doctor was amazed that the fracture had healed. So we had this very strange thing going on at Betty's house. And that is in the book, so I'm not revealing that for the first time. But what I'm going to reveal is that in Betty's files, as I was recently going through them, I found a document that she had written about a trip that she and her tenant, Debbie, had made to my grandmother's house. My grandmother lived about 20 miles away from Betty in Kingston, New Hampshire. And Betty would drive down several days a week when she was younger to visit the family. I grew up across the street from my grandparents in Kingston. And on this particular evening, when Betty and Debbie were returning home to Portsmouth, they were driving through East Kingston, New Hampshire, when a UFO came down and appeared to be pacing the car. It came down really low, and it shined a light into the car. And then the next thing they knew, they appeared to be in a different location. And Debbie said that she was never going to ride with Betty again. This reminds me so much of the case that occurred in Casey County, Kentucky in January of 1976, where 3 women were returning home at night from a dinner out to celebrate one of the women's birthdays. And they're driving home, and this UFO comes down and shines a light into the vehicle. And then the craft picks the car up into the air along with the women, and they are taken. So it makes me believe that Betty was probably taken more than one time. And we know now that when an experiencer is taken for the first time, they're either taken time and time again, or they don't have what the ETs are looking for, and so they're taken only that one time.
And of course, we have the fact that a lot of people that are taken a lot have one of the largest prerequisites of being an abductee is that it goes down family lines, right? And so
Yes.
the fact that your grandmother, along with Betty, and had the incident with the object, pacing the car, do you think it was possible that your grandmother was taken as well?
Well, my grandmother wasn't in the car that night, but was my grandmother taken from her home in Kingston, New Hampshire? Uh, Certainly, it is possible. After Betty's incident, and during the time frame when Betty was conducting contact experiments with Robert Homan and C.D. Jackson, who were two of the original investigators on the case in November of 1961. That's how far back in this case they dated. But after Betty's hypnosis sessions were over, they asked Betty to engage in contact experiments. So she was attempting to vector a craft in to land on my grandparents' farm. And every night she would attempt to send these telepathic messages that actually Robert Holman would write out for Betty, and she would simply think about and attempt to send them. So she would do this, and my grandmother started to see some UFOs on the backlands of her farm, hovering down fairly low over the trees. And then in April of 1966, there was a craft that actually landed on my grandparents' farm. It woke my grandmother up when it came in. One of our neighbors, who was a commercial pilot, was returning home from work and observed the craft coming in. And my grandmother woke my grandfather up, and he observed this too. But then they heard a strange sound on their front door. And it was sort of a knocking sound like this.
Interesting. So obviously the Betty's thoughts were manifesting. That obviously the visitors were listening and responding.
The visitors appeared to be listening and responding to Betty's messages. Now, certainly, if this is the case, she did not have only one contact with these visitors. And when this craft landed, it left physical trace evidence on the ground. The family saw this. It was photographed. It was investigated. And physical trace evidence was sent to Robert Homan and C.D. Jackson. So we know that this happened. The strange thing is that it was about in that time frame that my mother and I, who were directly across the street, both had this very strange dream that we were taken on board a craft and given this physical examination. We both dreamed that we were on the table. My mother remembered seeing me on the table and being upset and receiving an explanation about what was going on. Very, very strange that the two of us would have the same dream in that time frame. So, I don't know what to make out of that. We certainly don't have physical evidence related to it. We only have this shared dream.
And a lot of people who have been taken, obviously, they start to remember things from dreams. And to have such a vivid dream, shared dreams are in some cases common, but obviously they're not as common because how could two people link up in the same dream? At least that's what our mainstream scientists would say. Now, this is pure speculation. Do you think it was strictly a shared dream, or do you think it might have been a little more than that?
My gut feeling is that it was more than that. There was fear associated with it. And after that happened, I suddenly became very fearful of my bedroom closet, fearful of going to bed at night, fear of the dark. My aunt and uncle lived beside my grandparents, and I was a teenager, and I would go over and babysit their children. I suddenly became intensely fearful of crossing the street at night. That sort of thing that was not part of my behavior before that.
And that can infer that something happened where obviously something happened in the dark that created fear in your subconscious. And of course, of crossing the street, maybe something happened in your that's lodged in your subconscious of crossing the street that, of course, created the fear. How long did that fear last, if you don't mind me asking?
Oh, oh, I'm not fearful now. I don't know if I would be if I were alone, but sometimes when I'm alone at night, I still feel that. I felt it. I was driving alone through the White Mountains of New Hampshire. I went through Franconia Notch at night because I wanted to get a good look at the tower at the top of Cannon Mountain at night. And I became very, very fearful as I was driving through there as well. So there is some fear still with me that is associated with this.
And this goes with so many hundreds of thousands of people, possibly even millions of people around this earth, where they have fears that they can't associate with because they haven't quite remembered what caused it yet. And of course, if they've had some anomalous activity, we could presume that it has to relate with that. But let's pick that up when we return from break. Everybody stay tuned. So much more with Kathleen Marden, plus the winner to Contact in the Desert announced when we return from break, as well as you will be getting a preview of what Miss Marden will be saying. Stay tuned. We'll be right back.
This is Travis Walton, and you're listening to Dr. J Radio.
Welcome back to Hour 2 of Dr. J Radio Live. Of course, I am your host, Dr. J, with my co-host, Johnny Webb, live in London. Before we resume, just some news. Of course, last Tuesday's show, Nick Redfern is already set in YouTube and is going to be released tonight. Last week's shows, Timothy Good, Dan Willis, and Michael Cremo are also up. Another special show, an abduction panel with Travis Walton, also made the airwaves as of today. And tonight's show with Kathleen Marden will be uploaded by this weekend. So be sure and check it out. Also, if you do have any questions this hour, we will be taking calls. Or if feel like sending them via tweet, like as you have been, feel free to continue to do so. The number to call in if you have any questions, of course, and you want to you vocalize them rather than write them is 818-923-1713. Again, 818-923-1713. Also, let's talk about Contact in the Desert. That is coming in 3 weeks. 4 days of fun, 3 days plus the Monday, which has the special intensive workshops. Several speakers there. As a matter of fact, our guest Kathleen Marden is one of the speakers. I'm actually speaking. I have no clue on what yet, but I'm on there. And with that, also, let's announce the winner today. The winner of the 14th ticket to Contact in the Desert. Remember, these are $400 tickets. Is Christine Murphy. Christine Murphy, if you're out there listening, congratulations. You should be receiving an official email from them. And of course, I'll be sending you one as well. We have 5 more tickets to be given away. All you have to do is log into contactinthedesert.com/DRJ, contactinthedesert.com/Dr. J. The contest ends May 15th, but the winners will continue to be announced literally until the week of the event. So don't feel as if you haven't entered last minute that you're not going to win a ticket. Literally enter until next Friday. You have until then. And that is the end of our news. Now let's go back to Miss Marden. But before we do that, I want to ask Kathleen, where can people find you? Let's talk about where people can find your book, your website, and all sorts of that stuff.
Okay, well, my website is Kathleen with a K dash Marden, MARDEN .com. And you can purchase autographed copies of my book on my website. If you don't care about an autograph, it's available on Amazon. Some of my books are available at Barnes & Noble, but you can order them if they're not in the bookstore. And I have my books are now available in hardcover under different titles, in softcover that they were originally released in, as audio books, and as ebooks. So lots of choices there.
And I have to say, the Alien Abduction Files is one of my absolute favorite books because not only is it on my absolute favorite topic, alien abduction, it's got several amazing cases in there, diverse ones too. And of course, you see the commonalities of all of them. Now, the fact that we talked about Contact in the Desert, if I'm not mistaken, are you doing 3 things there, a lecture, a workshop, and a panel?
That is correct. I'm going to be doing a lecture on the evolution of contact. Going back to 1961, I thought about, maybe I shouldn't talk about Betty and Barney. I've done a lot of talking about that, but I haven't done a lot of talking in California about that, mostly on the East Coast and in the central part of the United States. I've done only 2 lectures on that topic on the West Coast. No, 3 actually over the years. And whenever I do lecture and I don't bring them in, people come to me and say, "Oh, I was so disappointed. I wanted to hear your lecture on that." So I'm bringing that in. I'm bringing in some of the major cases that have occurred over the years, along with the evidence that we have been able to collect. And also the case of Denise Stoner, which is the first case and one of the 2 major cases that I wrote about in the Alien Abduction Files with Denise. And Denise wrote a lot of those chapters about her experience, her own personal information and memories and response to all of this too. Then I'm going to be doing a workshop for experiencers, and this is going to be a little bit of a support group. It's going to be a little bit of the opportunity to learn how to collect your own evidence and what evidence to look for and how actually to collect it for scientific evaluation. If you want to ask the Mutual UFO Network to become involved and to investigate your case, or you might want to just collect it as confirmation that your experiences are real. And then for the third part of that workshop, we're going to do a little bit of light hypnosis, a little bit of creative visualization, and a little bit of post-hypnotic suggestion to help individuals to relax. Because, the study that Denise Stoner and I did in 2012, which was a year-long commonality study on experiencers, discovered that about 75% of experiencers have difficulty falling asleep and remaining asleep at night. And why? Because they're frightened. And we find out that once they've been able to work through this fear and able to control this fear, they're able to sleep much better. So that was something that we discovered, and I think that it's very important that we give experiencers tools so that they can at least attempt to overcome some of this fear, to relax at least, and to be able to move on.
To those experiencers, you are absolutely their savior, because for someone who's gone through alien abduction, first of all, people are telling them monsters don't exist and they're crazy. So some of them will go into self-destructive behaviors. Nonetheless, they have symptoms of post-traumatic stress, symptoms, obviously, PTSD. Then when they meet someone like you who's able to say, well, what you experienced is real. And not only what you experienced is real, here are other people who went through the same thing, who are in various stages of recovering from the fear. And hence, you've essentially brought them down to a much more peaceful state. So by you giving these people these tools to decrease the fear. And I'm so glad you brought that up, because I can't tell you how many people talk about the fact that they can't sleep or stay asleep because of the fear of the unknown. And whether it be from people who have conscious recall, whether it be from people who have regressed some memories, or people who just know something strange has happened to them and have seen things in the sky and have recalled some dreams but have no other memory outside of it. So I think it's going to be a really fascinating thing. One of the first thing you mentioned about Denise Stoner, for those of you listeners who don't know, when me and Miss Marden did our first show a little over 2 years ago, I actually might have been closer to 3 at this point, with Denise Stoner. I think it was about 2 years ago. Nonetheless, this was the crazy part. When near the end of the show, when Denise Stoner was talking about her own experiences, and when she talked about finding a DoD device that I believe the cable man, maybe you can correct me, Ms. Martin, what she found. We were cut off air, and that was physically and technically impossible, because being the host of the show, there's no way that the two guests could be connected if I was knocked off. Yet not only was Kathleen and Denise still connected live on air, none of me or my co-host could not get on. People were hearing strange sounds in the background, metallic sounds, sounded like water dripping. So bizarre. And the moment that it was over, anything was back to normal. To this day, that remains one of the most unsolved cases in broadcast history, which to me shows that it infers that she was hitting a point that somebody didn't want them to talk about. You recall that incident, right?
I do recall that incident. Yes, and it was during a time frame when I was attempting to determine whether or not this type of interference had something to do with someone not wanting us to talk about what we were talking about, or if it was merely coincidence. But it seemed to be happening. This is while we were promoting our book in the beginning, actually.
That's right.
And so when that happened to us, Denise and I finally lost each other on Skype. And so the funny thing is, I went to the phone, and I still wasn't really convinced that anyone was interfering here. And so I picked up the phone, I dialed Denise, and just, to be funny, I guess, I said, to the third party on this telephone, I want you to know that you are violating our rights to freedom of speech, and you are a criminal. And as soon as I said that, the lines went dead. There was no dial tone. And so then I, of course, went to my cell phone and I called Denise's phone and couldn't get through. So I ended up calling her cell phone. Well, Denise's phone was dead for 24 hours. Mine returned within 10 or 15 minutes. So she said that she would keep me informed. And the next day, she told me that she had the telephone people come over. She has, it's like the cable and the television and the computer is all wrapped up into one. But on that telephone line, the cable man, the telephone man, found a problem that he couldn't explain. And so he had to call his supervisor. And the supervisor came over and said to Denise, are you aware that you have a dedicated Department of Defense telephone line running into your home? And Denise was not aware of that. It was flabbergasted her. So that's her story.
Have you had any other cases of interference, or has Denise talked about anything else?
With the two of us, I really have not had much, but I'm watching what I say as well, because I kind of sense that there are certain things that I shouldn't be talking about, and I do not want to be cut off from the shows that I'm on. It's very inconvenient for everybody, so I'm very careful. And I have advised Denise to be careful about certain things, and she has not had any other problems since she has decided not to give some of the information she was previously giving.
And when Snowden went to Hong Kong with the files from NSA, did you know in the revelations, there's a documentary called Citizen Four, spelled out Four, about him, which documents the moment that the journalists arrived in Hong Kong to interview him, and all the way to the moment he was leaving to the UN to seek asylum to Moscow. He talked about that at any given time, 1.4 million people are at various stages of being watched. And I'm not talking about an aggregate. I'm talking about individual. Isn't that such a staggering number? 1.4 million people?
It is a staggering number, and it's reminiscent of information that we received during the Bush administration, where we discovered that average housewives were being listened in on in their daily telephone conversations. And there was the question, why are we doing this?
Domestic spying for no
Yes.
reason. Yeah.
Yes.
In violation of the Fourth Amendment, of course, which
Yes.
requires us to have, it protects us from warrantless searches and seizures. And of course, that is a search, invasion of privacy without a warrant. So, and essentially after that, the Patriot Act sort of quashed a lot of our rights, sadly. But, back to the abductions, I wanted to ask you something that's been literally on my mind from the beginning of the show. And it's something that's been really important to me because every case that, or at least the majority of the cases that I've heard about, a lot of people that want to recall what's happened on board these ships or wherever they're taken to say, I want to remember this. And the visitors are telling them, you're not going to remember this, or you will at some time. And then, of course, there's the other people that are told that they want to forget, and then they're advised that they're going to forget. They're not going to remember, but they will remember at some point. And then within that, on top of remembering at some point, that they're going to have some sort of missions, as if something's going to happen here on Earth, and then they're going to be involved in some missions. For instance, Jim Sparks talks about that his mission is to save the rainforests, but also when things happen and the visitors are known and they're finally here, that he's supposed to calm people down. What do you know about these missions? I mean, because obviously you've researched well over 1,000 cases, and I'm sure you've caught that recurring theme, which is what I picked up from your book, actually.
Yes, it's all very perplexing. First of all, why do some people remember so much of what occurs, such as Jim Sparks, whereas others don't? Good question. I can tell you that in the alien abduction files, one of the individuals that I wrote about, Jenny Henderson, a woman from the state of New Hampshire, and that's a pseudonym, but she had a tremendous amount of conscious recall of what had occurred. But that information came to her after Dr. James Harder from APRO had hypnotized her and given her the post-hypnotic suggestion that she would remember. Her memories were much more vague before that. And then suddenly she started to have almost full recall as far as she knows. We don't know if she was recalling what really happened or if it was a screen memory, but it certainly sounds a lot like what I've heard from all of the other people that I have spoken with over the years. So why is that? Why do some people recall that? Some people are told that they are being given missions. Some people don't know what those missions are. If my memories are correct, was told that I am a carrier of information. And that information is that they are here in a sense to help us because they think that we are endangered as a species. I mean, anyone might be able to derive that information just by looking at the state of affairs in this world. We killed 200 million of our own kind in major and minor warfare during the 20th century. So, that's pretty obvious. But what I was told, if this is correct, and again, it came to me as a dream, but I had a physical injury too, so it causes me to wonder if it was more than a dream. And I couldn't, the information was passed to me through eye-to-eye contact, where the ET put its face very, very close to mine. And it was almost received like a download of information. It wasn't there, and then suddenly it was flooding at a very, very rapid rate into my head, and I wasn't able to comprehend all of it. It came so quickly. And so I asked Denise Stoner if she would hypnotize me. And she did. And what I stated is that I wasn't positive if this was correct, but that they were concerned about human DNA sequences, and they're concerned that something is threatening our species, and it could, if we're not careful, lead to the disintegration of our species due to changes in the DNA structure that is being caused environmentally. And they, without really interfering or attempting to propagate our species while they study us, they said, in this dream, whatever it was I had, they're studying the DNA of my family line and watching for changes in the DNA structure, which would be an explanation for why they study family lines. They told me this is important for the survival of the species, and they're sorry that this is sometimes frightening, But they do the best they can to do this as quietly as they can without interfering too much in our lives. They're concerned about the hysteria and much misinformation. They said that very frightening information is being disseminated that's making humans hostile toward them. And when there is really no valid reason for this hostility, they said that it's based upon falsehood. But they also added that even although they have a policy of working quietly and surreptitiously without interfering, there are others who do not have the same policy. The grays that I have encountered in these dreamlike states believe it would be too disruptive and might cause hostility if they were to come out in great numbers and show themselves. They're under higher orders from a higher source to continue as they've been going. But these other species are not as concerned about human reaction, but that is a concern to them.
I'm wondering if the fact that there's so much hostility is because of what the government has instilled. I have so much to actually ask you about that, but I know Johnny's got a question that's come from another listener in the UK. Go ahead, Johnny, and ask it.
Hi, Kathleen. Yeah, this is a guy from Paul from West London. He asked a couple of things. He said, have you ever been abducted towards children? Do you have any children that you may or may not know about that could be hybrids? And the other question was Linda from Brighton in West Sussex. She asked, why don't we get more experiencers coming out with all of the information that we have today?
Okay, two very good questions. First of all, have I seen, I guess, hybrid children on board craft? No, I have not. I have no conscious recall of that. And I have not had more than a few hypnosis sessions to probe any of this. So, no. And why do so few experiencers actually come forward? It is because of fear of ridicule. It is because of fear that they might lose their jobs, their standing in the community. There's a tremendous amount of ridicule toward experiencers. Experiencers are ostracized from their peer groups, or they might be. And I have to tell you that there is an organization. It is the Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial Encounters. The acronym is FREE. And their website is experiencer.co. And they have launched a campaign for equality for experiencers. And October 1st is going to be Experiencer Liberation Day, meaning that it's okay to talk about your experiences. It's okay to admit that this has really happened. That's the movement that we at Free are attempting to start. It worked with gay rights, it worked with civil rights, it worked with rights for the handicapped. It is time for experiencers to stop being attacked, to stop having the kind of terrible and traumatic experiences that they experience from human beings who are reacting to what they have to say, calling them hoaxers, calling them nutcases, calling them kooks and cranks. There are so many words, and in our society, it is okay to attack someone who claims to have had these experiences. It's really not okay, and it's time for that to stop.
Exactly. I agree. It's never been okay at all to attack someone on anything, especially as bizarre as it may have sounded. If someone genuinely has fear or any other negative emotion associated with an experience, people need to respect that and not attack that person. And I wholeheartedly agree with your answer with what you just said of why so many people don't come out and come forward with their stories because of that. Like you said, they're going to lose their job. They're going to be labeled a nut. They're going to be ostracized and so many other things. And going back to what you said earlier, a lot of people I've asked that are skeptics or on the fence said, what would you do if you saw a giant flying saucer hover above you and start to land? You know what a lot of people said? They'd shoot at it. They literally would shoot at it. I mean, that if we have that kind of response, then I couldn't imagine. It makes total sense why these visitors would not want to show up in mass numbers. And then another thing you said, which really struck a chord, which makes total sense, that yes, they cause fear, but at the same time, when we have a dog that's on the street and it's running away from us because it's scared, but we just want to save it because we know it's been, say, shot with an arrow or is lost and we want to bring it to its owner, it's going to do its darnest to run away from us and bite us and attack us. But yet all we're trying to do is help it. So if you apply that same sort of logic with what they're doing to us, even though there's fear, if they're just out there looking at checking our DNA, especially down the family lines to see for changes, as you mentioned, then that's actually a good thing for us. And so if you look at it from that point, then it's not necessarily a bad thing. And then I'm going to throw one more twist in. I'd love to get your comment on this. This first thought originated with Jim Sparks. I heard it from him, and then I went ahead and asked a lot of people, a lot of the Zero members, since on the West Coast there's a lot of them here, and that other people that have had experiences that I think are legitimate. Most people start with fear, but yet when I ask them if they've been lifelong abductees, over time, the fear subsides for a lot of these people. And I say to them, if you had a chance to never have been abducted in your entire life and remove all the trauma and those experiences you've had in your whole life, would you choose to do so? And a lot of people say no. They said, despite having all the fear, despite everything that the PTSD and other symptoms that were associated and the sleepless nights, they wouldn't change it for anything in the world. And I thought that was really fascinating. And I'm wondering, how many cases have you come across where people said the same thing, that they embrace them being taken when they started out as fear?
You know, it's really amazing because my findings are the same as yours. And when I first started working in this field, I would have loads of people coming to me and saying, I want this to end. I want this to end. What can I do? And I was aware of some things that people had done to attempt to make this end. And I even had 2 or 3 people who told me that they were able to get it to stop for a period of time, in one case, as much as 15 years. At least this individual didn't remember being contacted in that time frame. But then, so I would give people these ideas, and they'd write to me and tell me about their experiences or talk on the phone. And finally I'd say, well, you know, what are you doing? Have you tried to make this end? And I'd find out, no, they hadn't. They really didn't want it to end. In fact, I have one case right now. This is a case out of Canada that I have been investigating for about 2.5 years at this point. And the experiencer had something placed in his arm. He could feel it, and I advised him to go to his physician, and he did. And finally, they ended up deciding to have this removed. So the physician removed this, what we thought might be an implant. And then the experiencer came back to me, and he was so remorseful and feeling that he had done something really wrong, and felt that he was losing this connection that he had with these individuals from this other world. And, I said to him, well, you probably have more than one implant in your body. And they probably know where you live. So why don't you just give it a little time? And I have a feeling that they're going to come back and find you again. And so, about a month later, he wrote to me and he was elated that he had another visit, that they were back. So, it's just an example of what tends to happen. Bud Hopkins always said to me, never trust an alien. They tell you they're doing all of these kind and great things, but you should never trust them. But I do.
That comes to my next question, which was, where do you see this in terms of, say, demons and angels? And are they of the light or of darkness? And can you or do you find a comfort from it like Jesus is for some people?
Well, I find no comfort in relationships with extraterrestrials. It's just sort of like seeing the great uncle that you visit with once or twice a year, something like that. For years, I investigated cases, and they all seem to follow the same scenario. But more recently, cases have come to me, and I'm the Mutual UFO Network's director of experiencer research. So I have probably 2 to 4 cases a day that come across my desk that I read about. And I was beginning to find cases that seemed incredibly negative. In one case, there was an elderly couple. They were in their late 70s, and they moved into this home, and all of a sudden, they started to have things happening to them in the night. And they were a professional couple. They were incredible people. But their bodies were being gouged with deep scratches and faces, all kinds of horrible things going on that didn't sound ET at all. And
More supernatural.
Yeah, from what I saw on the internet as I did some research on this, and is that it looked like it was demonic, that this was some kind of a negative entity attachment. And I've had another case where this took place at an airport, and the owner of the airport started to see what he thought were UFOs outside, and also to witness these entities. But the entity that was in a photograph he sent to me looked really demonic, and very strange and evil things were happening on that property as well. It was even investigated by the state police, and I spoke to the police officer who was doing this investigation, and he was convinced that this was demonic activity, but somehow parts of it mimicked this ET contact, but only in that there was a craft scene that, and I don't, it could have been a coincidence. It could have been that UFOs were coming in and they opened up some kind of an interdimensional window that permitted these negative entities to move in. I don't know, but it's a very, very distressing part of this. But I do not think that ETs and demons are one in the same. And I've discussed this with Paul Eno. I don't know if you're aware of who he is, but he's a long-time paranormal researcher. He started out studying to be a priest, and he was also studying to be an exorcist, and ended up finally not going into the priesthood. He ended up getting married and has 2 children, and one of his children works with him. But he writes a lot about these parasitic entities that attach themselves, sometimes generationally as well. But the characteristics, the modus operandi, are different than what I see in real cases with extraterrestrial beings, or what I believe are extraterrestrial beings, such as the Greys, such as the insectoid types. Different appearance and just different behavior. This taunting, this behavior where they will come to the person's bedroom night after night after night and taunt them and scratch them, will grab them by the ankles and leave claw marks on their ankles when they hold these people upside down. And you might be thinking, well, I don't believe in demons. These people have to be mentally ill. But the Catholic Church has even studied some of this, and these individuals were not mentally ill, and the activity would end after an exorcism was performed. So I would never have believed it, but I'm beginning to believe that there are these very negative and evil forces here on Earth too, that have the capability of attaching to entering our environment and attaching to some individuals. Another characteristic that Paul Eno mentions in his book and in the talks I've had with him is that these, you know that you have one of these if this is going on in your home and you also have a spike in your electric bill, that they tend to feed off the electrical energy and they tend to feed off human emotions as well. On the other side, we have the angelic part of this. And I've spoken with individuals who have told me they thought they were being visited by extraterrestrial beings, but they were so kind and gentle and angelic and helped these people along and cured these people. Now, I've heard of ETs curing people as well. In fact, I was cured back in 2012 from an illness that I had had for many years. And over 50% of the experiencers who participated in the Marden Stoner Commonalities study stated that they had received the gift of healing from extraterrestrials. So there's a little overlap here and there. The lines are not clearly drawn, but I believe that there are some characteristics that are clear that are extraterrestrial, that involve extraterrestrial contact, and not angels or demons.
You did talk about some of your contactees that had been clear of contact for the last sort of 10, 15 years in some cases. I recall that, I can't remember his name off the top of my head, but he was a MUFON guy from Florida, and he brought on stage 15 experiencers who all claimed that they were able to stop their abductions continuing by calling Jesus. And I wondered if you'd ever come across any of these experiences yourself.
I am not aware of anyone who, well, I've read about this, I've heard about this, but I have not worked with anyone that this worked for if they were actually in contact with extraterrestrials.
You know, I've heard them feeding off negative emotions, but the electricity, that's new to me. But at the same time, it doesn't surprise me because, of course, you hear so much about electric anomalies happening, whether it be poltergeists or extraterrestrials or extradimensionals, ghosts, regardless of what you want to label that sort of being. There's always something associated. For instance, electronic voice phenomena is just one thing. So part of it surprised me when you said, if your electric bill is suddenly spiked.
Well, that's not ET involvement, though. I'm sorry if I confused you.
No,
it's not extraterrestrial. Yeah, it is negative entity attachments.
Poltergeist, exactly, ghost. right. That's what you were saying. Yeah, I should have been a little more clear about that. But that's something that I didn't know about that in the past, but it didn't surprise me one bit in that sense because they do feed off of human emotions. And I'm sure you heard about that famous case in Indiana. It was all over the news. As a matter of fact, some famous person bought it where a child had an attachment, a negative attachment, and things were happening in front of police officers, Department of Social Services. The child was thrown across the room, up the chair. It was climbing on the wall. Even in the hospital, in front of nurses and the doctors, it was climbing on the wall there. And this was a child, and in front of all these witnesses. That was just a very, very bizarre case, and that was recently in Indiana. So these days, this day and age, nothing surprises me. But going back to the ETs, you talked about a few of these races. We always hear about the grays, and then of course we hear that there's the shorter ones, and some people say that they are actually more biorobots, and that the ones in charge really are the taller grays, the more loving ones. And then of course, in your book, the first time I saw the drawing from Thomas Reed, the insectoid, the one that's sitting like an M, and I've also heard about the reptilians. You've dealt with all these cases. Can you pick out a couple other different species that you've come across in your research?
Well, certainly the reptilians. That's another one that, and I'm sort of on the fence about that. There's recently been a research study on humans' response to these different types of extraterrestrial entities, and only about 16% of the participants in this said that they had very negative contact with reptilians. So often we hear in the media that these reptilians are very negative and they have these primitive emotions and they rape women and that sort of thing. But in the most recent research study, the findings were different than that, and most of the participants had a positive attitude toward their contacts with reptilians, which is very, very surprising to me. Also another type that people report is the human type of entity. And, this dates back, my gosh, back into the 1950s when you think about the Space Brothers who have come here to help humans and who are more highly evolved spiritually. Back in the 50s, all of the investigators said that this was nonsense, and many of the people who were actually stating this had a criminal history. So, they failed lie detector tests. They were caught in hoaxes. Yet today, we have individuals who are stating, and oftentimes confidentially, that they have contact with these kind, human type ETs. So it's all very perplexing.
It is. And when I first heard about the human-looking ETs, I didn't in the 80s. That's when I first started paying attention to ufology, and really the obsession started to grow. And then hearing George Adamski about the Venusians, that long hair, blonde, blue eyes, I didn't believe it. I really didn't believe it. But then, of course, as the decades passed and you started to hear so much more about it, and then when I started to hear about the hybrids, how they looked more and more human each generation, and people started inferring that they were walking amongst us, then I started to realize, well, it's not that unreasonable to believe that we could have been seated here, or we could have been taken from here and put on a planet similar to Earth and evolved in essentially the same way. So that's never initially that blew my mind, but now it doesn't seem too far-fetched at all in one bit. But now that I brought up the hybridization program, that is something that I meant to ask you that I slipped my mind from the beginning. The evolution of hybrids. Going back to the 70s and the 80s, I remember Debbie Jordan Cobble say that the first time she laid eyes on the hybrid baby that they told her was hers, she said it looked closer to them, very stringy hair, giant dark eyes. But lately, from the people that have talking about the hybrid children that they're shown, they seem to be more and more human. And I'm wondering if you know anything about that. Is it because that each generation of hybrids, they're crossbreeding more with humans, or are they just perfecting what they're doing, or what is your research uncovered with the evolution of the hybridization program?
What I have learned from all of this is from dating back into the 70s. Individuals were seeing these tubes containing the artificial sac, where I don't know what to call it at this point, but there was a hybrid inside this tube or this tank, and it did look very much like the Greys. Yet, I have the case of Jenny Henderson, and what she recalls did not seem to be that much gray. It appears that there are many stages that they are going through, and I suspect that over time they are attempting to create a better human. And I wouldn't be surprised if these are being inserted into the womb of a pregnant woman. Perhaps her fetus is being removed, and another fetus is being put in as a replacement for what was there. And of course, these would be genetically related to this woman, probably genetically related to the woman's husband as well, but would have some of this ET genetic code as well, unless they're just altering the human genetic code. But I think that there's more going on than that. Why would they have created these hybrid beings that looked so much like themselves?
Sorry, I hate to interrupt because we
go
got
right ahead.
less than 10 minutes left, and actually we got two more listener questions, and I don't want to do them disservice by answering them after the fact. So I'm going to go ahead and bring Danny to ask the first one, and then Johnny to ask the one that's coming out of the UA. Go ahead, Danny. Danny, you still with us? He might be muted. Let's go ahead to Johnny. Johnny, go ahead and ask that question that came out of the UK.
Yeah, that's Greg in Surrey has asked, with all the knowledge in the public domain, or what he says is, with all the info in the public domain to go on, why do you think that you were taken? And that's to yourself, Kathleen.
If I was taken, and I don't have solid evidence of that, I believe it is because I am genetically related to Betty Hill. She was my mother's sister, and it would make sense that my mother and I were taken because they claim that they are following and studying family genetic lines. That would be the only reason.
No, and I would definitely think not just that too, also the fact that it's possible that your grandmother may have been taken, and they therefore maybe even further than that. But staying on your family's case, there is another question from another listener that I'm going to let Danny. I think Danny's ready to ask. Go ahead, Danny.
Yeah, I'm ready. Hi, Kathleen. We got a question from Lou in California, and he wanted to know, when would you make all and every tape of the regression hypnosis sessions available, or are they already out there?
He must be talking about Betty's and Barney's hypnosis sessions.
Okay.
And those hypnosis sessions are owned by Dr. Simon's estate. And so I do not have the legal right to release them. In addition to this, it was Betty's desire that those tapes would not be released to the public either. They're private, confidential medical information. That is the way they are perceived legally. And I have to tell you that there are some excerpts from sessions they've had on YouTube, on the internet, that people can listen to, just snippets of part of what happened. And they have been put there illegally. I have had them taken down, and the individuals put them right up again. There's nothing I could do about that. At this point, I'm not going to spend all of my time having them taken down. So I have done what I can to protect them as medically confidential pieces of information as the trustee of Betty's estate, and to protect them because they belong also to Dr. Simon.
And they are just that, and they are very personal. Like you said, they are medical tapes, medical history. And when they were leaked, I felt so sorry. I mean, yes, I wasn't alive at the time, but when I heard how this story came about, it just bothered me from the sense of the violation of privacy. All of a sudden, you have this experience that Betty and Barney are kind of going out of their minds, wondering what happened, and yet their trusted person, Dr. Simon, who they're telling every single detail about their lives to. I don't know if it was him, but wasn't it some of his, it was his staff that leaked him, right?
No. What appears to have occurred is that there was a woman who was an investigator, who was a ufologist, who befriended Betty, and who Betty told, gave inside information to, this confidential information about what happened. This woman lived in the town of the newspaper reporter who leaked this information in the Boston Traveler. So I have a paper trail that shows how this occurred. So I think that I have the correct story, because this reporter got in touch with Betty and Barney, named this woman in the letter that he wrote, and said that she had described them as very nice and told him about their experience, which was a violation of confidentiality, but he was going to write about it. Betty and Barney went to lawyers to try to prevent this from happening. They were so upset. They thought they were going to lose their jobs. Barney had been appointed by the governor of the state of New Hampshire to serve on the U.S. Civil Rights Commission, State Advisory Committee. He was very active politically in the state. And this was devastating to have this occur, but it did, unfortunately.
Exactly. And that's what made me so saddened about the moment, because I've been in situations where I've seen people's medical history being violated. Of course, you hear stars all the time going into hospitals and people looking at their records and then sharing them and talking about social media. It is a total violation in every single way. Sadly, Ms. Marden, we, as always, we can go on for hundreds of hours, because I never, ever get bored of speaking with you, let alone with this topic. But I wanted to spend the rest of the couple minutes remaining to ask you to tell everybody out there listening, if those experiencers who are still not talking, what would you have to say to them?
I would have to say that I respect their rights not to come forward. But if they are interested in talking with someone confidentially, they can go to MUFON, MUFON.com, and under research, there is an experiencer questionnaire. They can complete the questionnaire, and they will be able to talk confidentially with a member of MUFON's experiencer research team. It will not go to anyone else. It will not be written up for MUFON, or unless they want it to be, unless they want an investigation. But they can talk to us confidentially. They can also do the same thing with the Foundation for Research into Extraterrestrial Encounters under support. They can find support there. So there are two different avenues available.
I definitely think that having that system set up is really important for all those people out there, especially, I agree with you. Those who don't want to talk about it, don't talk about it. Don't feel compelled to, especially if it's going to jeopardize your job. I actually had someone who confidentially told me their story, and for that reason, they don't want anyone else to know because of their job. So nonetheless, you are truly helping people, and I think that having such a system is great because it's helped several people out there. Sadly, we are out of time, Kathleen Marden, and it's always a pleasure to have you on. I truly look forward to seeing you at Contact in the Desert.
Me too.
And as a matter of fact, Stan Friedman will be joining you there as well, colleague. And that's another question someone else had out there, as how he's doing. Can you give a quick update on him real quick before we run out of time?
He's doing extremely well and still working hard.
And that really is it. Everybody, thanks again for joining us. Join us Tuesday for John Anthony West, as well as next Thursday for Congressman Merrill Cook with Stephen Bassett. This is Dr. J of Dr. J Radio Live, signing out.